Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Fazbear Entertainment would like you to put your hands together for the one, the only, Freddy Fazbear.
Rewritten! Content warning. This video is not made for kids. It contains fictional depictions of mental illness, fictional violence, and fictional abuse. The fictional characters in this story are heavily afflicted by the things that I have spelled out to you, and some of the inner monologue seems to suggest that they should be getting hurt like this, but that is absolutely not the case. Me portraying this abuse or mental illness is meant to show the audience how the illness or abuse feels inside of the mind of the afflicted person, so they can sympathize and maybe stop themselves from following a similar pattern in the future. Be careful if you are easily triggered. You're most likely about to enter the mind of someone who is heavily afflicted by illness and abuse. Viewer discretion is advised. Bonnie could smell rust in the dark. The sickening metallic tang rolled over him like fog, scraping its way through his nostrils and filling him with itching, corrosive poison. Fingers scratched at him inside of the eternal darkness, like rats scrabbling frantically at the walls, just as desperate for escape as he was. While the staff bots wanted to get out simply to fulfill their programming to keep cleaning the Pizzaplex, Bonnie wanted to get out because of the pure mental torture of being left all alone in this living, ravenous darkness. The overwhelming numbers surrounding him would have made it impossible to get away, but what was even more cruel was the fact that he couldn't resist at all. Bonnie was paralyzed. His body could not twist away from the clawing, wheezing machines, even though he was fully conscious and aware that he was being picked apart. All that he could do was listen as it happened. His legs went first, and his arms, and pieces of his stomach, and the plating on his head, and his eyes, and... Bonnie was thrusted out of the horrific memory, his body spasming into a disoriented tangle of sheets and fur. For half a second, terror plunged down to his core when he felt that Freddy wasn't beside him. But just as he opened his mouth to scream, he heard, Oh no, Bonnie, it's okay, Bonnie, I'm here." Just as Bonnie picked himself up, Freddy latched onto him and hugged him tight, trying to calm him down. Every part of Bonnie was still stinging with the shock of the nightmare, but his hyperventilation began to slow the longer that he stayed in Freddy's arms. You're okay, Bonnie, I'm here. It was just a dream," Freddy kept on repeating, rubbing his back gently. Bonnie relaxed, closing his eyes and trying his best to block out the sound of the staff bots gnawing on him. His arms and legs were still here. His eyes were here. Vanessa had given his basic structure back when she had pulled him out of the scrap dump, even though the spare parts had been just as old as he was. It had been months since he was dismembered in the dump, but his brain still insisted on returning to the state he had been in for 5 long years. Bonnie turned to look down at his new right arm, confirming to himself again that it was still there too. One of the technicians, a younger one that was kinder than the lead professional, had given him a normal right arm back, one that lacked the weaponized bowling ball that Vanessa had fitted him with. They explained that they had done that because they didn't want Bonnie to forever live with the unmedicated pain of a missing limb. It was probably the nicest thing a technician had ever done for him. He wasn't back in the dump. He wasn't even back with Vanessa. He was safe. Freddy was here. I'm so sorry that I got up," Freddy stammered. It was just for a few minutes. I thought it would be okay." A sour guilt sank inside of him for making Freddy feel bad like this. Bonnie was being stupid. Logically, Freddy couldn't go very far from him. All of the animatronics had been locked inside of their rooms for the past 5 days to keep them out of the way of the investigation. The Pizzaplex had shut down temporarily for the police department to examine the various crime scenes scattered all over the mall, so they had nowhere else to put the animatronics. The recordings from their eyes let them skip over the step of trying to prove that they weren't lying about what happened, but that didn't mean that the authorities were happy about what they saw. Bonnie had quickly grown very familiar with Freddy's room, with nothing else to do but talk and pace. Gifts from the kids were plastered all over the walls, scribbled crayon drawings and smiling stick figures encompassing them completely. The only other features in the room was the broken bed frame, the mattress, the charging station, the ring of light bulbs surrounding the mirror, and the desk covered with sheet music. It was a small room for both of them to stay in, but Bonnie would rather stay with Freddy than let Jeremy Miller come up with a different place to store him. Their boss still hadn't told them what was going to happen to them. The suspension was driving them crazy, but nobody seemed bothered to give them updates on their fate. The only good sign so far was that they were still sending electricity and fluids to their charging stations, even though Freddy had to share half of his portion with Bonnie. So they didn't want them all to immediately die, but that wasn't really a promise that they would be kept alive indefinitely. Bonnie just tried not to think about it. Freddy was doing something odd. He was tilting his head back up towards the ceiling, his ears perking. "Listen," he whispered. "What is it?" Bonnie asked. "It's quiet." Now that Freddy had pointed it out, Bonnie began to pick up on it. For the past 5 days and nights, there had been a constant commotion above them, unintelligible words being passed back and forth between officers, odd equipment clinking around that they couldn't quite identify. Despite Freddy's best efforts, Bonnie had found it almost impossible to get to sleep with all the noise. And now that he was thinking about it, Bonnie realized now exactly how he had been asleep a few minutes ago. The noise had gone completely silent. The two of them waited for a little bit, expecting for it to start up again. It never did. Bonnie couldn't tell if that was good or bad. He really wished that someone could come down and give them an update, but they had no contact with anyone since they had gotten repaired.
Hey! Anyone else hear that?
Roxy's yell was muffled through the wall, only able to reach them because she was at her top volume.
What?
Monty hollered.
I said, anyone else hear that?
Roxy repeated with a spike of irritation. This was how every conversation between them had gone for the past 5 days. They were all locked in their rooms, so the only way for them to communicate was to scream at the top of their lungs and hope that the others were paying attention.
Yeah, it's quiet.
Chica called. They all paused, taking in this new information.
Is that good?
Monty yelled.
I don't know.
Roxy yelled back.
I'm still getting a charge, so they haven't cut us off yet.
Chica piped up.
Yet.
Monty added. They all fell silent, the suggestion prickling at the back of their minds.
Wait, I'm sorry, that was morbid. Pretend I didn't say that.
Monty mumbled. His apology still didn't make the concept go away.
Freddy, do you think they're gonna...
Roxy began, the tremble in her voice detectable even through the walls. "No, I won't let them," Freddy called, touching the corner that was closest to Roxy's room. "Jeremy can't afford to complete your replacement. It might not even be beyond blueprints. You'll be safe for a long time. For now, we just have to stay where we are and be good."
If they cut us off, could we start knocking down the doors?
Monty asked. That had been something that they had extensively debated about on the first day, eventually coming to the conclusion that they would only get in even more trouble if they tried to break out. "We might have to, but they haven't cut us off yet. We just have to wait and see what happens," Freddy said. "I'm sure that Jeremy won't put all of us down. He needs the money that we make to recover from the new lawsuit after all this is over." Bonnie didn't miss his specific wording. All of us. Nauseating terror wound even tighter inside of him, and he did his best to hold it at bay. He didn't want to have another panic attack. It would just stress Freddy out even more. Bonnie hadn't known every piece of what had gone down on the day that Gregory entered the Pizzaplex, but he could read Freddy's body language to know how nervous he was about the stability of the others. His ears were twitchy, and he kept on chewing on his bottom lip until there were tiny indentations. He had been regularly calling to Chica and Roxy and Monty, trying to make sure that they were doing okay, but his comfort couldn't reach them properly, the lack of privacy from the other members of the family making it impossible to be honest. Bonnie hoped that the animatronics beyond this hall were also alright. The morning immediately after June 28th, aka the morning after the incident with Gregory, Jeremy had absolutely insisted that they give him the videotapes before being repaired. Freddy pushed Moon to go first, since he was the one that was the most injured. Bonnie could still vividly remember the sound of Moon's labored gasps for air as he got weaker and weaker, forced to stand there and bear through it as a loading bar crawled pixel by pixel across a screen at a speed that a snail could easily outpace. By some miracle, Moon stayed conscious for the 5 grueling minutes it took to give Jeremy the footage, but when the technicians asked him to follow them so they could fix him, Moon collapsed. The last they had seen of the daycare attendants was Freddy dragging them into the repair room so the technicians could save Sun and Moon's lives. The technicians hadn't been done repairing them by the time the other animatronics had been sent to their rooms, so the rest of them didn't know how Sun and Moon were doing, or if they even survived their injury at all. Every time the daycare attendants crossed his mind, Bonnie was hit by guilt. Sure, Vanessa had made the wound worse, but Bonnie was the one to originally do that much damage to him. Bonnie only hit him that hard because he thought that he was going to kill Vanessa, but in retrospect, he came to the obvious conclusion that Moon had absolutely not deserved to get his chest shattered by a bowling ball. It wasn't just the daycare attendants that might not be doing well. Just when the others were being escorted out of their maintenance rooms, DJ's technician started to scream that there were severed ears behind DJ's faceplate. Only when they got back to their rooms did Bonnie remember where Vanessa had told him to put James's body parts. Before, Bonnie hadn't asked enough questions, probably because of the effects of the chip. But now, even with a clear head, he couldn't figure out why Vanessa had told him to do that. There had to be a reason. She wouldn't have gone through all that trouble just to be creepy. Everything that she did had a purpose behind it. An odd detail stuck out to him, one that he hadn't recognized as weird beforehand. Sun and Moon hadn't been given a piece of James. Bonnie wasn't an expert on how ghosts worked, but he did remember the part of Afton's story where the missing children came back to get revenge. Bonnie wasn't sure what to think of that. And now the explanation would be gone forever, so he had to live with that eternally unanswered question now. To make things worse for DJ, the platform of his maintenance room was the only closed-off place that they could contain him. So, for now, the poor guy was completely isolated in parts and services, too far for the rest of his family's voices to reach. Actually, no. Even if he wasn't too far, he wouldn't be able to hear them anyway. Bonnie had been startled to learn that DJ was deaf now. He hadn't been deaf when Bonnie was sent to the scrap dump, so he had no idea why DJ hadn't spoken to him aloud until Bonnie finally asked Freddy if something was wrong. Once he got the full story of why Jeremy Miller had taken his voice and his sense of hearing, it only worsened his nervousness at what was going to happen to them. If Jeremy was willing to permanently mutilate someone who had known him since he was a child. The conversation fizzled out, and they were once again left in almost complete silence, listening intently for any signs of life above. "Do you need to sit down?" Freddy asked at his normal volume. Bonnie had still been holding onto Freddy's arm the entire exchange, and Freddy knew that Bonnie couldn't stay on his feet for too long. Bonnie nodded, and the two made their way back to the mattress. 2 years ago, the bed frame had apparently broken from old age, leaving the mattress flat on the floor. Still, it was better than nothing. Bonnie thumped back down onto the bed, wincing at the stiffness in his spine. The only thing the technicians had fixed about him was his missing arm, meaning that he was just as decrepit and slow as he was when his family first found him. Freddy had been trying for the past couple of days to clean Bonnie off, but they didn't really have the supplies to do that in his room. The treatment he could provide was mostly just comprised of rubbing smears of filth off with his blankets and giving him plenty of extra oil to help loosen up his joints. Along with the grating pressure at each movement, the rust was surprisingly itchy. It felt like a colony of ants biting him all at once, but when he actually scratched it, it only made it flare up and burn like a nasty allergic rash. Bonnie would probably have to have almost every part of his body replaced to feel normal again, but he was doubtful that Jeremy would ever waste that amount of money out of the kindness of his heart. Bonnie reached up and started picking at his teeth again, the rubbery gums throbbing around each artificial root. His teeth were what Bonnie wanted to clean the most, willing to file them down if it meant ridding himself of the mess. Though Bonnie had no sense of taste, he could still smell Gregory's blood in his mouth, the image of a crazed, monstrous version of himself biting into Gregory's skull, refusing to leave him alone. A fluttering panic began inside of him, and he tried his best to smother it. That was probably the thing that he was most scared of. None of them had news on how Gregory was doing, but he was undoubtedly sent to the hospital, and anyone with 2 eyes and half a brain cell could tell that an animatronic had bitten him. And unfortunately, this wasn't a rumor only sparked by their proximity to a dead body, like the original miscommunication that they had killed Vanessa and James on purpose. It had been recorded, just like everything else that night. Hey, now, don't do that. For what felt like the 100th time, Freddy pushed his hands away from his teeth. You're gonna wear them down even more like that. Bonnie clamped his hands onto his knees instead, having not been aware of how much he had been scratching at his teeth. I'm sorry. It's okay. I know it feels awful. Bonnie had bitten a kid. Bonnie, the animatronic that was already out of the eyes of the public, had bitten the kid that was going to be the center of the next big lawsuit leveled at Fazbear Entertainment. They all knew what happened to animals that bit people. They were going to put him down. Either that, or... The flashes of his nightmares surged upwards, the sensation of jagged metal and frayed wires scuttling down his spine. He didn't want to go back. He couldn't go back. Bonnie hugged himself even tighter to Freddy, the contact helping dull the fear a little. It was something about his soft fur, something about the security of feeling another person with him. I'm not going to let them do that, Freddy whispered to him without needing to ask him what was wrong. I meant what I said. I promise I'm not going to let them take you. A part of Bonnie wanted to burst up in protest, to explain every reason why things weren't going to be okay. But he just felt hollow. He didn't want to upset Freddy even more. So he just nodded, pretending that it helped, trying to loosen his hold so his claws wouldn't hurt Freddy. What was wrong with him? Every thought in his head was abrasive and frustrated, making him want to tear at his ears again. But no, that was the problem. He couldn't start tearing at his ears. Freddy would get sad if he started doing that. That was literally all Bonnie ever did anymore. Just make other people sad. He was making Freddy give him half of his rations, and he knew how draining it was to only be allowed to charge up to 50%. He kept on having panic attacks. His insomnia kept making Freddy stay up late, trying to soothe him into sleep. Bonnie knew how unpleasant it was to look at him, much less hold on to him 24/7. But he couldn't let go. There was a spazzing, unquenchable need to be holding him, like Freddy would dissipate into atoms if he let go. Stupid. He honestly didn't know why Freddy was trying to help him. They all knew what was going to happen. Even though Bonnie would rather die than return to the scrap dump, he didn't want Freddy to get thrown down there too. If Freddy got in trouble trying to defend him from Jeremy, he couldn't bear the thought of Freddy going through something like the dump. Footsteps. Bonnie snapped his head up, listening. Yes, he was sure of it. They didn't carry the clunking weight of an animatronic. Humans, multiple humans, were walking down the stairs. Freddy had picked up on it at the same time that Bonnie did, the two of them shooting up from the bed. They only had to take 3 steps to meet the door, pressing their ears against the cold surface. Their suspicions were correct. People were coming down to see them. The restrained thrum of panic began to rise, bursting up out of control within seconds. Bonnie jerked back from the door, still holding on tight to Freddy's arm, the sensation of grabbing three-fingered hands lashing over his back. Hey, it's okay, Freddy was telling him, leaning down to look him in the eye. Look at me, Bonnie. I'm not going to let them take you, I promise. It's not that Bonnie didn't believe that Freddy would try and protect him. It was that Bonnie believed that he might not be able to. Bonnie reached up to his throat to touch the only part of him that was shining new. His shock collar. Down in the dump, Vanessa had removed the one that he had been paralyzed in. The spare Bonnie was currently wearing had been lying around in storage somewhere, and the moment that the technicians realized that Bonnie wasn't wearing his collar anymore, they forced him to put this one on. It was a simple necklace of a medallion shaped like a golden bowling ball, appearing as a harmless accessory to customers. The weight of what it could actually do to him made the thing feel like lead chains. I won't let them, Freddy repeated, recognizing the thing that Bonnie was thinking about. You'll be okay, just stay calm. I won't let them take you.
Rise and shine!
Pierce, Roxy's manager, pounded on her door, making her yelp.
Quit that.
An older voice snapped. Bonnie recognized it to be Monroe, Freddy's manager, who was now approaching their door with the jingling of keys.
God, can't you take anything seriously? Time to get up, come on!
Huxley's gruff tone was coupled by the pounding on Monty's door.
I'm up!
Monty said in exasperation. Bonnie couldn't move. Every part of him, all of his entire being was centered on the door, despite Freddy's attempts to distract him from it, things growing colder and colder as the gritty rust dug deeper and deeper inside of him. And then it opened to reveal Monroe's freshly shaven face, as stern and urgent as ever. Get out, now. Please, no, not this again. I can't go back. Freddy gave his arm a squeeze to try and shake him out of it. The only reason Bonnie ever took a step forward was the remote clutched in Monroe's hand. Bonnie followed Freddy closely, still keeping a hold of his wrist as they entered the hall. Almost immediately, Bonnie locked eyes with Huxley. The man was built like a lumberjack, his beady swamp green eyes squinting out from behind a bushy brow and ragged black beard. The wide slope of his shoulders lowered as he raised his chin, making it clear to Bonnie that he had seen him. Monty was let out of his room behind him, straightening up in the hall with his tail rigid and jaws curled down into a frown. Huxley turned his scowl on Monty, the two of them locked in an intense staring contest, waiting to see who would shy away first. Huxley was Bonnie's old manager, or at least his old new manager, if that made any sense. Although Huxley wasn't currently his manager, Bonnie wasn't sure if they were going to give him another one, if they were just going to scrap him again anyway. He had been the manager that Jeremy Miller had appointed him after taking over the company. Bonnie's first manager, the one before Huxley, had been a kind man named Quinn, but the days of working alongside him were long gone by now. Jeremy said something about how Quinn was too soft on Bonnie, that Huxley would be able to whip him back into shape. All that Bonnie had known in the horrible month before he had been scrapped was Huxley's frustration and scorn. Bonnie shrank behind Freddy, trying to take up the least amount of space as possible, hoping that they wouldn't notice him there. The managers of the other animatronics were boxing them in on all sides, drawing out Roxy and Chica. Chica was missing a few feathers, but the state that Roxy was in made Chica appear perfectly healthy in comparison. Roxy still only had one hand in burned sockets in place of eyes, because apparently the technicians didn't have those parts pre-ordered yet, the same reason that Gregory hadn't been able to repair her on the 28th. The technicians actually got mad that Freddy had given Roxy one of his eyes and immediately removed it and gave it back to Freddy no matter how much he protested, saying that they would rather log Freddy as fully repaired than have both Freddy and Roxy missing an eye. Roxy's new parts had probably been shipped in by now, but repairing her would only come after this meeting. It soon became clear that only their personal managers were sent here to retrieve them. There were many other employees in the circle of people that monitored the animatronics, like accountants or secretaries that wrote incident reports and submitted them to Jeremy. But the ones that were the most hands-on with keeping track of them throughout the day and disciplining them were the 4 people surrounding them right now in the hall, urging them to hurry up and get to the stairs. Chica guided Roxy up each step, gaining speed once they got into the rhythm of it. Monty followed soon after, his snout poking over his shoulder to see if Freddy and Bonnie were coming too. Everything inside of Bonnie grew colder and colder as they climbed up the stairs into parts and services, his aching joints and torn shell protesting at every movement. Everything inside of his head began to jerk around in frantic bursts, getting faster and faster the closer that he got to the top. He could hardly feel Freddy at all anymore, even though he was still keeping a death grip over his arm. He watched his feet as they made it up one step after another, limping and dragging, staggering a few times, the sound of Huxley behind him only making the pressure worse. Step after step after step. Please don't do this, please don't do this, I can't go back, I can't go back, I can't go back. His throat constricted, tremors running down his spine and legs, finding it harder and harder to draw in the air that he desperately needed to cool off. Run. He wanted to run, he wanted to make a break for it, but there was nowhere to go. He couldn't go back. Rusty hands, scraping, grabbing. He lurched away from the sensation, but almost face-planted into a support beam, causing Huxley's forceful, "Quit that!" Bonnie tried to hurry up, but he was only making more and more mistakes, terrified to hear Huxley raise his voice, knowing what would happen to him if he messed up. He knocked into Freddy, disorienting them both. Freddy reached back to catch him, preventing the domino effect of the others, but that didn't stop Huxley from growling. "Hey, quit that already!" I'm sorry, Bonnie squeaked, pressing himself into Freddy, waiting as Monroe used the keypad to open the safe-like door that was blocking their way. Freddy was gently rubbing his back, but Bonnie could feel his hand shaking. He closed his eyes, praying to anyone who could hear him that they would at least have the mercy to finish him off before throwing him back down there. Maybe he could convince them of that, at least. Jeremy probably loved money more than his own wife. It would be less expensive to let Bonnie die. He had never gotten the real answer as to why they kept him alive when he was down in the scrap dump. They had connected him to a charging station at the dump, letting him stay alive for all 5 of those horrible years. Was it some sick act of torture? That just didn't sound reasonable, even for someone like Jeremy. That much commitment to torturing him was just plain ridiculous. There had to be some sort of other plausible reason that they hadn't killed him. Bonnie wanted to ask, but he was certain that if he started to speak again, he would begin crying uncontrollably. Please, just kill me first. At least give me that dignity. The door unlocked with a jarring clank. Bonnie kept his eyes glued to the floor as they entered parts and services, concrete and steel hiding them away from the outside world. Heat began to waft off of his shell, making it feel like he was being boiled alive as they filed into the cramped passage and closed the door behind them. Bonnie knew that Jeremy was staring at him, even though he was too scared to look up. He just kept his head down and followed Freddy as they were ushered into DJ's maintenance room, taking up the same positions they had a few days ago. Piles of jagged, rusty metal, milky robotic eyes leaking trails of brown oil, snapped wires sparking. The smell of it. Bonnie snapped his eyes shut, trying to block it out. It was just the scrap pit around the platform, but it was so similar to the hellscape underground that Bonnie couldn't stop the chilling fear from washing over him. Several dim notes knocked him out of it, and he turned to see DJ's big, boxy face pressed up close to the rest of them. The others were giving him little waves and nuzzling against his cheek, unsure if they were allowed to speak to him right now. The poor guy was clearly trying to smile like he was fine, but Bonnie could tell from his droopy eyes and fidgeting fingers that he was uncomfortable and cramped. DJ always hated small spaces, which were most spaces in the Pizzaplex for a machine as big as him. The managers were standing right there, every single one of them. Bonnie could feel their presence in the passage, feel every one of their eyes scorching through Freddy and locking onto him, following him no matter where he tried to hide. Bonnie did not dare to look at them, instead shriveling up behind Freddy like they would just forget about him if he was motionless for long enough. "Where are the daycare attendants?" Bonnie's knees shook just at the sound of Jeremy's voice, and he pulled at the shock collar, trying to give himself more space to breathe. Freddy gave his hand a gentle squeeze, but even his protection didn't feel like it would be effective enough against someone like their boss. "Taylor should be getting them," Monroe said quickly. "She has to walk a little farther than us. She'll probably be here any minute, sir." There was a sigh from one of the managers, a few shuffles. Were they all staring at him? Did they all know what was going to happen already? His urge to look up at their faces began to overwhelm the urge to hide from whatever expression they wore. Slowly, he tilted his head upwards, each of them coming into view one by one. Huxley, Monroe, and Harper were watching him intently. Harper was Chica's manager, a younger woman with an overload of makeup and a displeased curl to her nostrils as she looked him up and down, probably thinking to herself how disgusting he looked. Monroe was uptight as always, carefully surveying all of them, like he thought that one of them would pull a knife on them. And, of course, Huxley hadn't looked away from him the entire trip here, still retaining the predatory glare, just waiting for him to trip up. The only ones not looking at him were Pierce and Langley. Even though Pierce was in charge of Roxy, he was leaning against the wall with a bored look on his face. And, of course, Langley was on his phone, not keeping track of DJ like he was supposed to. And then, between the wall of agitated adults, he could see the back of Jeremy's head. His hair was more neatly combed than it had been in the first encounter, and this time he wore the usual deep green business suit that he was always seen in. But he was watching the elevator, the one that linked parts and services with the ground floor, the one where the daycare attendants would probably be coming through. Bonnie was somewhat glad that at least Jeremy wasn't staring him down, but it made it even harder to get a read on him. He remembered the last thing that Freddy had said to Jeremy. "Your father would be disappointed in you." The weirdest thing about Freddy's comment was that there hadn't been a repercussion for it. Not yet, at least. Had he told the other managers what was going to happen? Was he excited about it, or would he be angry and vengeful? The death of his sister had to have taken a toll on him, even though the relationship had been falling apart. The elevator dinged. Time was up. With so many managers between them and the elevator, they couldn't immediately see the last few people to join them. Instead, they just heard the click of high heels and the creaking of thin metallic joints. Monroe shooed the other managers so that they would make a path, finally letting Miss Taylor come into view. The sharp, wrinkled woman's hair was pulled back into such a tight bun, it looked like the force might rip her scalp off of her skull. Her horn-rimmed glasses only barely hid the needle-like points where her eyes were set, her spindly hand still holding the remote as if it had been freshly used. And then, when she split off to line up on the wall with the other managers, they were finally allowed to see the daycare attendants for the first time since transferring the video footage 5 days ago. Son looked awful. That was the first thing to stick in Bonnie's mind. He drooped further with every shaky step, his shoulders hunched and spine bending like he was pulling a great weight behind him. His bleached hands picked at the red ribbons around his wrists, his jester-like clothes only barely clinging to his skeletal frame. Even the sound of his bells was duller, shakier, completely drained of all the life and joy that Bonnie remembered him carrying. The yellow rays that framed his face were wilting like the petals of a dying flower, torn and picked and pulled on for what must have been every moment that Sun was in control of the body that he shared with Moon. He didn't look at any of them. He didn't bounce up and say hello like he normally would. Instead, he just shuffled alongside the other animatronics, tilting his circular disc-like face so that they couldn't meet his eye. It seemed that Sun and Moon had, in fact, survived their injury and had been fully repaired. But even though the two of them seemed physically okay now, Bonnie could tell that it wasn't just their body that had been broken. Sympathy pulsed inside of Bonnie's chest, knowing how horrible all of this must have been for them. Not only had Sun and Moon lost Vanny, but they were also on the chopping block for it, just like Bonnie was. Is Gregory doing all right? All of the animatronics turned to Freddy in alarm. Not at the question, but the fact that he decided to speak before Jeremy did. Bonnie peeked a glimpse at Jeremy, then hid himself fully behind Freddy. In the split second that he saw him, Jeremy's annoyance had been made abundantly clear. Before Jeremy could give a response, Langley said noncommittally, yeah, they're saying he's fine. Bonnie could still see Langley from this position, and the guy was holding his phone up as evidence. Bonnie was honestly shocked to see that Langley was using his phone to keep up with the news, rather than just play random mobile games. Jeremy's displeasure grew, but Langley seemed completely unaware of it. Yes, the kid is fine. They had to give him some stitches and shots, but they checked him out of the hospital soon after. Jeremy elaborated, probably just to stop them from interrupting him with more questions. He's been returned to his mom. Freddy relaxed at first, but then stopped and said, His mom? Yes? Freddy exchanged a knowing look with the others. All of them were programmed with the same sense to pick up on the signs that a child was being mistreated at home. We all have concerns that his mom might... That's not what we're here to talk about. Jeremy's spiny tone silenced them. In the peripherals of his vision, Bonnie saw everyone's heads tilting down submissively as they snapped their mouths shut. Jeremy waited for a full 15 seconds afterwards, testing their restraint. They stayed quiet. All right, thank you, Jeremy sighed. Here it was. Even though Bonnie was too frightened to move an inch, his thoughts were stampeding in a panic, his pounding chest begging for him to run. The smell of rust. It followed him everywhere, the tang of a wet penny, crawling over every inch of his shell and digging deep into every crevice of his endoskeleton, picking him apart bit by bit. No matter how closely he pressed himself into Freddy, he couldn't stop feeling the staff bot's hands on him. He listened in a numb, frozen stupor as Jeremy spelled out their fate to them. Freddy, he began, you will not be euthanized. There was an intake of breath, then a nudge as he looked back to the rest of his family in confusion of what that implied. But Jeremy quickly went on. Montgomery, Chica, Roxanne, and DJ Music Man. You also will not be euthanized. There were shuffles behind him, some exhales of relief. Chica signed the news to DJ, but the repose was brief when the people who had not been called on began to gather what this could mean. Sun and Moon. Jeremy slowed and stopped, waiting. Bonnie wouldn't find it hard to believe that Jeremy wanted them to start pleading for mercy. But Sun didn't even bat an eye. You won't be euthanized, Jeremy finished begrudgingly. Sun barely reacted. All that he did was say in a hollow and weathered tone, Okay. Only one more left. Freddy wound his paw around Bonnie's, bracing for it. Please don't, I can't go back. Bonnie is gone in the eyes of the public, Jeremy told them, his words piercing through the jittering haze that had overcome Bonnie's thoughts. I'm going to let you keep him, but in return, you are not to talk about what happened on the night that Gregory entered the Pizzaplex. Safe. He was safe. Bonnie hadn't really quite registered that yet, chills still raking his body, having to confirm several times that he had in fact heard something impossible. When kids ask about it, when parents ask about it, you do not answer, Jeremy said, striding back and forth from one wall to the other, catching each of their eyes in turn. You may tell them that it's confidential, but you will not mention any details of the story other than the fact that Vanessa was at fault and on June 28th acted on her own to go against everything that this company stands for. If any of you disobey me and speak of what happened, I will send Bonnie back down to the dump and you will never see him again. Do you understand? Yes, sir, of course, we won't speak a word, Freddy said, followed by a chorus of similar confirmations from the others. Good, Jeremy said, coming to a stop in the middle of the hall again. Freddy glanced back to Bonnie, meeting his gaze. The smile crept up on Freddy's face, and Bonnie felt a matching one grow over his own. Freddy nuzzled into Bonnie's floppy ear, and Bonnie felt an almost delirious laugh escape him. He could hardly believe it. Jeremy spared him. It was the kindest thing he had ever done for them. A giddy lightness bubbled up inside of Bonnie, and he didn't care that the managers were watching him anymore. Thank you, sir, Freddy said, while Chica and Roxy hugged Bonnie tight. Thank you so much, sir. Before they could get too happy, Jeremy took a step towards them and continued. Bonnie no longer has a place in the Pizzaplex, but I'll allow him to stay down in one of your rooms during work hours. His eyes narrowed, his tone sharpening back into complete seriousness. But don't think you can get away with anything more than this, all right? This decision was made out of pure convenience. The light in the animatronics' eyes dimmed, their heads dipping further with every word that he spoke. We're going to continue business as usual on Monday, and when we do, you're all going to tend to the customers and entertain the children and follow every single order that is given to you. You will not speak of June 28th. You will not cry about June 28th. You will not even think of it. If I hear anything from your managers, and I mean anything, you will lose this privilege and Bonnie will be taken. Do you understand me? By now, all the smiles were gone. I said, do you understand me? Yes, of course, Freddy said quickly. We will, sir. Jeremy leaned back, his shoulders loosening. As long as we all stay in line and act normal while going through this lawsuit, the public will eventually forget. Of course, sir, Freddy whispered. Satisfied, Jeremy turned to the managers, muttering to them, Tell the technicians to repair the Fox, and then get them up to the ground floor. They can begin helping with the cleanup. Woo! And we're on to Act 4. Let's go! So, I think that I should probably put this here to, like, explain what's going to be happening with the lore, because, so, since each of the chapters inside my note thing is, like, Gregory's chapter is always paired with the other one, so, like, Gregory's chapter 1 is paired of 29, and Gregory's chapter 2 is paired of 30, you know, they're meant to be, like, released at the same time, unless if something crazy happens. So that means that there's only lore for one thing, because, like, it's they're all set into one, and I only have one lore marked down. I'm not like making the lore up as I go along. This is a thing that I've been planning and solving my own puzzles over and over and over again, just to make sure that it's all watertight and everything. So like, I can't like make stuff up and then put it in there just because I'll be like, oh no, I have to have a lore for Gregory's and 29, 30, 31, 32. Instead, I'm just going to be doing the lore that I've already put. I'll just decide on, like, based on what it is. Sometimes they have to be inside the numbered thing with 29, 30, 31, 32, etc. because they're like matching up with like a puzzle thingy of the numbers of the chapters and stuff. So I'll just put it in whichever one of the two is most convenient. And since there was 2 pieces of lore for this one, I was able to do Vanessa's diary thing. Vanessa's murder diary with Gregory. and then the creepy cryptic code thing with this one. So yeah, that's how the lore is just gonna happen. It's either gonna be one or the other, or sometimes it can be 2 if there's 2 pieces of it. So yep, that's it. I've been talking for too long. Okay, bye. Chapter 30 is gonna take forever to get out because it's the one that is 76 pages, but trust me, it's going to be awesome. I'm probably gonna like cut it in half so that it doesn't take forever, because I can't, talking too long. Shut up. Okay, bye. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.